in a kingdom of immense wealth, where golden towers touched the sky and silence was commanded within palace walls. There lived a king who believed that his power had no limits. To him, the kingdom was his creation, the people his servants, and their silence his proof of control. Yet beyond the polished marble of the throne room, past the velvet curtains and the jeweled halls, the streets told a very different story. Hunger stalked the alleys, poverty clung to families, and voices trembled in fear of speaking against their ruler. But one day, when silence was demanded most, a single voice broke through, piercing the walls of the palace like a blade. On the dusty ground before the iron gates of the palace, there sat a beggar. His body was frail, his clothes tattered, but within him burned a fire greater than his weakness. He had no wealth, no sword, no crown, only a voice. And that voice rose with desperation and power as he cried into the air, "Bread, bread." His cry was not just for himself, but for every empty stomach, every weary soul, every broken life in the kingdom. His voice echoed through the narrow streets, climbing the stone walls, bouncing off rooftops, soaring until it reached the windows of the golden palace itself. It was a cry that could not be ignored. Inside the palace, the king stirred. Wrapped in silk and gold, surrounded by servants eager to bow at his command, he was not accustomed to interruption. Yet the sound of the beggar's cry cut through the air like thunder. He clenched his fists, his voice shaking the hall as he bellowed, "Who dares disturb my peace? Whose voice dares challenge the silence of my rule?" His ministers trembled. The guards stood frozen. And so the king summoned his most loyal servant and ordered him, "Go at once. Find this man and silence him, for I will not have my peace broken." The servant bowed and hurried through the gates. There, on the ground, he found the beggar weak in body, strong in voice. The servant leaned close and whispered urgently, "Good man, I beg you." The king commands silence. "Please, lower your voice, for your cries disturb him." But the beggar only lifted his head higher. His face was pale, his hands shaking, yet his voice rose even louder. "Bread, bread." His desperation was not diminished by fear, for hunger has no fear. The servant pleaded again, softer this time, "If you love your life, stop this at once." Yet the beggar's cry grew stronger, as if every starving soul had joined his voice. When the servant returned, his steps were slow and heavy. Bowing before the throne, he said, "Your Majesty, the man will not be silent." The king's face darkened with rage, his crown glittering as he leaned forward and thundered, then cut out his tongue. He has no tongue. He will have no voice. Let this be a lesson to all who dare disturb the silence of my reign." His words cracked like a whip in the hall, and everyone trembled. But in the servant's heart, doubts began to grow. Obeying his orders, the servant returned to the beggar. He drew close, his face filled with sorrow. Looking at the beggar, he saw not a troublemaker, but a man whose suffering was shared by thousands. He whispered with trembling lips, "The king commands me to cut out your tongue, but even if I obey, even if I silence your mouth, your cry will not disappear. For your voice is not just your own, it is the voice of hunger, the voice of injustice, the voice of every soul suffering in this land, and no blade can silence that." His eyes welled with tears, for he knew the truth of his own words. And so the beggar cried again, louder than before, his voice shaking the walls, "Bread, bread." The sound rolled through the streets, carried across the market into the fields, where farmers paused their labor to listen. It reached the noble houses, where wealthy families felt an unease they could not name. Quit from ear to ear, from heart to heart, until the cry of one beggar became the cry of the people. The kingdom itself seemed to speak with his voice. In the palace, The king sat frozen. He ordered the windows closed, but still he heard it. He ordered musicians to play, drums to pound, soldiers to march, but none of the noise could drown the cry. He pressed his hands to his ears, but the sound lived within his mind. He tried to sleep, but the cry followed him into dreams. His palace, once a place of power, had become a prison of echoes. No matter how he commanded, no matter how he raged, the sound would not die. At last, the king sat alone in his throne room, the weight of his crown pressing heavier than ever before. His treasures surrounded him, his guards stood ready at his command, but he had never felt so powerless. For he had discovered a truth that no ruler wishes to learn, that power can command obedience, but it cannot silence truth. That fear can chain the body, but it cannot bind the voice of justice. That a cry born from hunger will always rise, louder than any royal decree, louder than any threat, louder than the voice of a king. And so the beggar remained, his cry echoing through the land, a voice that could not be silenced. The people listened, their hearts awakened, and the king learned that in the battle between power and truth, truth will always be heard.